Since our audience is basically students, I think a few critical words were mentioned here: indeterminacy, projections, complexity, and pedagogy. So Ms. Eisenman, how to ease to our students their life, how to make them, you know, transcend from being in the world to being somewhere else?
Well, first of all, I really appreciate Mr. Stojanović's intervention, precisely because I helped to certainly define my own project by being on his jury right now. So I'm now walked into the room with Mr. Stojanović's project, and he says, well, what do you think? And I said, well, I'll tell you what I think. Where is the project of the ground? And it seems to me precisely because this project must be suspended above the ground, has no relation to the ground, has a problematic relationship with what I call the discipline of architecture. That's number one. And if we were to anchor it to the ground, we would find it very much more problematic. Wherever you would put the ground in that, whether you put it at the halfway point or not, and half is underground, I don't know. So for me, that would be my first critique, which you would have to answer for me, because I don't know where the ground is, and for me, the ground begins architecture. Whether inside or outside is irrelevant. The second question I would be is, where is the space? In other words, if I were to frame, cover all of these elements, how would I, and where, how would I walk? Because the minute you start putting floors or something that approaches the problems we have of architecture, you ruin this. I mean, it's a beautiful piece. Do I like it as it is? Yes. The minute you say, is it architecture? I say, I ain't sure, because I am a traditionalist, I'm a classicist, I believe in floors, I believe in walls, I believe in the ground desperately, and so therefore I'm not an avant-gardist computer guy at all, and I would not allow my students, when they produce aggregation, to produce this, because ultimately they have, as Mario will tell you, who sits in every week, and maybe since he is a computer guy, can tell me where aggregation, in my terms, is working. I would argue that in all of the presentations that we saw today, there is the problem of making physical, not material, but physical. For example, Ingeborg, the virtual house, we did make a physical model of it. In other words, we did, you left off the fact that there was this crazy drawing which looks like it didn't have a ground and it didn't have inhabitation, etc., but it did. And we insisted on that.
Yeah,
okay?
Yeah, we have the model somewhere.
So I think it's important to put that into the argument. The first argument about heterogeneous starts with Alberti, because Alberti produced an idea of homogeneous space. This was the first idea that there was space, number one, was the first person to articulate that architecture did in fact have space. It had never been argued. Spatium was argued first by Alberti. That's why I go back to him. And the spatium that was in Alberti was homogeneous. And as far as I understand the notion of the computation, it has the possibility of producing not homogeneous space, but heterogeneous space, that is not a consistent multiple, but an inconsistent multiple. And therefore, the project of the computer was in fact to work away from homogeneous. And in fact, what we see today is in fact homogeneous space. The projects that Mario showed for me, could be characterized in the projects, and I don't need to name the architects as he did, because they're all friends of mine, are producing homogeneous space, consistent multiples rather than inconsistent multiples. So I believe that the digital must be able to help us move away from the Albertian or critique the Albertian model of homogeneous space by heterogeneous space. And it was not whomever Mr. Stojanović said was the first one to deal with heterogeneous. It was Alberti who argued for homogeneous and thus for its alternative heterogeneous space. The other project that upsets someone like myself when we get into seeing things like this is the question of the phenomenological. And I had assumed that the phenomenological as a project in architecture, a philosophical project, which first reared its ugly head for me in 1960 with Norberg Schulz's book, Intentions in Architecture, which was followed with the Phenomenology of Space by Norberg Schulz, and brought forward a whole host of Nordic inspired projects and progeny, including Johanni Pallasmaa and my own favorite, Peter Zumthor, who is Nordic in disguise, I guess. For me, the Derridian notion of the deconstruction, of the taking apart of the sign and the signified, of the fact that there were free-floating signifiers away from the signified, that is, from the physical object itself, the possibility that post-structuralism brought forward in 67, 68, and 69, I thought had effectively demolished the phenomenological, at least the phenomenological misunderstood, not the Heideggerian phenomenological, but the misunderstood northern version of people like Norberg Schulz. Instead, what I find coming back today in a very toxic way is this digital phenomenological, which is not necessarily an intention, but a byproduct of where the digital is today. And in other words, it's not about the deconstruction of phenomena, it's about the putting forward of new forms of phenomena, and I think, and of materiality. In other words, I am not really concerned with how a piece of wood goes together with a piece of wood as a fetish. To me, that is phenomena, because I'm more concerned with how those pieces of wood going together produce a heterogeneous notion of materiality as opposed to a homogeneous one. So I have a very strong aversion to much of the reading. I mean, the most clear person about the digital is Patrick Schumacher. And if you want to see in a synopsis his very strong view of what he is doing, and we are very friendly, by the way. In log 28 is an interview that I did with Schumacher, which explicitly tells you what his project is and why it might disagree with my own project. As far as aggregation is concerned, there were two reasons for using it. One, I had already used the term way back in the 80s. I've forgotten, in fact, that I had used it. To suggest an idea of against composition, and today as against the digital idea of aggregation, which has been seen to occupy us this morning or this afternoon. And if you examine what my students are doing, and I don't have the examples, but it's very clear that, one, it's very difficult to avoid composition, number one, because all things that one does, we're so weaned on decision-making that is compositional that it's very hard to detach composition from making. And of course, one of the things that detaches composition from making is the digital form finding versus form making, which is a project of the digital, and which is where aggregation in terms of the digital comes in. I can't say I could show you images today of the work that the students are doing, and you could say, here is a notion of aggregation, here is a notion of composition. The jury that we're going to have, which in fact these three people are going to be on, is going to assess that project, whether it's useful or not, and whether what does it produce. That is, the notion of being for aggregation against the digital compositional and against the phenomenological. It's very clear what the project is, and it is very, let's say, aggressive as an idea. So my question to Professor Stojanović would be, what is it about that project that deals with the ground, that deals with horizontal surfaces, that deals with space? Because for me, in other words, if you were in my class, I would have to say, even though I love the object, I would say, hey guys, where are the floors? You know, where's the ground? And where do I be? And so and the minute we would do that, we would, I think, destroy the fabulous thing that we see, right? Which is a great thing, but is a spider web architecture, right? And I ain't sure, because a spider web depends upon no ground, depends upon a function outside of that. So that would be a question. I don't know, Mario.
Can I offer a mediation before you get into trouble?
Thank you. Use the mic, please.
Mario is the mediator.
Since I'm between the two of you, before you, I think we should look at that not as an example of architecture, because as you pointed out, there are no floors and there is no space.
No ground.
And no ground. This is an experiment, in fact, in structural engineering, in my opinion. This is an experiment. It does not belong to architecture as a discipline which deals with the making of space. It belongs to another discipline, which is engineering. It is about testing the resistance of some materials. This is a very noble and important discipline, which happens not to be yours, but perhaps... This said, wait, because then the worst is still to come. When you look at this as an example of engineering, testing the resistance of material, my problem is, this is an example of phenomenological engineering. And then you would be upset again. And to some extent, I am myself. Because underpinning this kind of experiments, I do not know about yours in particular, but this, you were a BAA?
Yes, this is
is the somehow notion that some materials cannot be modeled because they have a way to behave which is too complex even for the most advanced science we can produce. And so the only way to see how they behave is to make an object and then sit down, wait and see what happens, which is a negation of modern science, whether you do it analogically or digitally, or even if you apply the postmodern science of indeterminacy as they exist in science and in technology. This is, in my opinion, there is the risk of a deep misunderstanding about the notion and the nature of science, which may have deep and, in my opinion, dangerous ideological implication. But now you speak for yourself.
Okay, you stole a few words of mine just at the opening of your argument, but thank you very much for the mediation. Firstly, it's a huge compliment that we have opened the discussion with the image that I've shown. However, I refuse to be drawn into the discussion on architecture, since this is not architecture. I have never said that I am presenting a piece of architecture with the image over here. It is really close to what Mario was trying to offer us a help, and I think it's more of a question related to epistemology, basically. And in a sense, do we think about introduction of ways of experimenting and developing knowledge in architecture that are different from projective design, in a sense? And the many questions that you have raised trouble me as well, and I have to answer them to myself as well. But then, nevertheless, the aim of such experiment is to raise the questions and move on, and eventually, maybe through many iterations of the design, it might become architecture or might not.
No, but Stojanović, I have to pursue. You're running away from me. You are an architect. You're on this panel because you're offering another version of this research into the digital and analogic project of architecture, right? To suddenly back off and say what you're showing us has nothing. As you know, the studio I'm running is not backing off. They have to make architecture in the end, right? And it's going to look very conventional compared to this, right? And I know, I mean, if you take Hernan Diaz Alonso, if you take Greg Lynn, if you take any of these boys that are dealing with these kinds of studios that look like giant Swiss cheese, you say, where's the space? Where is what it is, you know? And all you get are very strange answers. And I've not seen the movement from the image that you've shown, which we all agree is a very fascinating image. The question is, how do you move from that as an experiment to what might be considered architecture? That's where I ask the question. I'm not against the experimentation. What I'm saying is, are you training architects? And if so, what are they learning about architecture that will prepare them to deal with ground, space, floors, etc.? That's my question.
May I?
You can one more answer. I think maybe Mario will help me again.
I would actually.
Mario, by the way, if you think that Mario was helping you, then you're really in trouble.
Those friends are the worst, huh?
May I suggest?
Mario was being nice.
Well, that's what I
Could
said.
I suggest, Djordje, could I suggest that I ask actually Mr. Cohen to respond to your question and then hear Djordje? Because I'm aware of your discussion regarding pedagogy with Mr. Eisenman.
It would be the only way would be to, you will have to find a way to argue that this is a necessary means to a different end. Some kind of step in that direction. I mean, I'm also not inclined to do that kind of work in a studio, but you could, and I think this is what Mario is alluding to, argue that to undertake certain kinds of exercises or intellectual projects that could be done that eventually will move back into the realm of the studio. I suppose you want to argue that. I don't know. I can't help you here really that much. You're going to have to do something.
But,
you're going to have to, right? I mean, because, all right, sure, it's not a building yet. But the question really is, why don't you want to go ahead and do a building? What would be wrong with asking the students to go ahead and do one? You need to make the argument about why that's not a good way to teach. Because for many years, some have thought, there have been many professors who have thought that to teach the students directly, to apply these questions in the realm of building is not the pedagogically best approach. Is that what you would argue? Can you argue against what Peter is doing?
Okay.
let me make sure that I get him back.
Yeah.
Because Mario is in the studio every week with us, offering a critique of the term aggregation and how we're working with it. So I'd like to think that we're operating with some kind of liminal, at least, relationship to current theory. Therefore, my question to you is, where are we in a problematic situation dealing with ground floors, etc.? Where's our problem? Because for him, that's a problem.
Well, that's his problem.
No, but you should be able to articulate what his problem is, especially the phenomenological one.
I don't see any problem in dealing with ground and floors and space, because that are the ingredients of architecture. But today the topic is one particular tool, which has been so important for architecture since the early 90s. And in a nutshell, my argument was, there was a point in time when you thought that that tool would be a friend to your project.
Right.
And then you change your mind. But in my opinion, this is not because you were wrong. It is because that tool at some point was stolen away from you by a technical development which in the early 90s you could not anticipate. The juggernaut, the Leviathan, who came and hijacked the digital tool, I call that the spline modeler, which is a tool which comes from modern mathematics, which simplifies everything you do. And this is something you don't like. And
no, but
many people
Mario,
don't like.
no, Peter could still do exactly his projects with splines or whatever. I mean, I think that's not the problem, really. I think, frankly, we have a philosophical divide here. Because I think there is an approach here to articulate the digital medium, which is not dealing with gravity, really, and materiality, except if you go really high-end simulation tools. And that's a huge problem. So whatever we generate is lacking materiality, and gravity is off. And you can see this even within this construct here. So, and I think one of the tools or the explorations is precisely that you're teasing out what is that kind of interface between the digital and the materiality, the real. And I think that's where the exploration is running right now, Peter. It's not, I think it's very abstract and not addressing your concerns of, the ground, etc. But I think it addresses something architectural, in fact.
Because it's so abstract and it loses.
No, I think
all the people that it shouldn't lose is me.
Yes, no, I think I'm with you on the question of ground. Of course, there's a lot missing here, but at the same time, the spectrum of what needs to be still to be explored with it is so large right now in terms of the materiality questions and the transformation from the real into the real. So, for example, Lynn's work, right? We can debate it's maybe not even architecture. We could say it is not really good-looking architecture. You can say it's not critical architecture. But I think what he does constantly fresh, whether it's with the teapot series, even the embryological houses, or now also with his material, researches, it is putting the finger on a new, for me, always fresh discourse in a way. The embryological house is the parametric prototype. Of course, it is totally rudimentary. Of course, it's fully simplistic. But it, I think, propelled a whole discussion in architecture with now people invested into more details, more discursive development of parametric prototypes. So I see these always as seeds in a way. Then currently he is working with materials. I think there's a huge change coming up what are the materials constituting architecture, and he is just at the tip of the iceberg. Of course he explored it with a sailing boat because he loves it, but also because the industry is right now using already material we don't use in that way. So you could say that could bring in back something like modern architecture, which I think was also to a certain extent autonomous when they started it, because they were totally out there where pushing the status quo around. And we could say maybe we will witness something similar coming up. So I think we've got to be a little patient about it. But I agree, there's a problem with if we fetishize what we're looking at right now. It's beautiful, it's provocative, and yet it's not coming in the discourse of architecture.
I'm talking about making a theoretical, critical judgment of a Patrick Schumacher, because I got Patrick to say that the scale of build doesn't matter. It's the same at every scale. That means the part at one scale is the whole at another scale. And
But
I'm saying is, Patrick, that's precisely the problem.
That's the homogeneity.
That's the homogeneity.
right.
And if Patrick Schumacher stands, and he is the most elaborate theoretical construct that we have as far as from an architect, if that's where architectural theory of the digital is, that we're back to part to whole relationships and scale doesn't matter, then I believe there's a big problem.
Well, but look, I think he comes from. I mean, I think this is the whole generation of Deleuzian-inspired, people doing architecture in the way that we believe the fold. There is scale, but the idea is that there's a continuous differentiation of scale. So that which occurs as difference is just a momentary difference at a certain moment in scale. So, and I think, of course, it's totally naive. If you build the architecture, or if you think the urban, there is a scale. Of course, there is a scale.
They're building it.
Yeah, but they're building it to scale. Trust me, Peter. I saw it. I mean, and it's
Splines.
They are.
Splines parametricism means, excuse me for the brutal simplification, means spline making. Parametricism is a new term which describes the mathematical splines, which being a continuous parametric function, is permanently editable and scalable. It has no scale. It's mathematics, which is not architecture.
I want to ask you something though, Peter, because I mean, we're talking about homogeneous versus heterogeneous space. And
consistent versus inconsistent.
And yeah, okay, consistent, inconsistent multiples. And Inge is talking about the evolution of this project toward other ends. Let's say, for example, even she has mentioned eco, what do you call it?
I call it always ecologic.
Ecologic. She's now mentioning the material project of Greg and other projects that would, in the case of Greg, lead into the actualization of the performance of materials as they manifest themselves according to the constraints of movement, for example. They literalize and physicalize these things. Okay, now, my question to you, Peter, is, are you still committed to the idea that architecture is a mental construct, more so than an objective, physicalized construct, or it should remain a construct that the mind works through and that represents and brings to consciousness, makes the effort to make evident that possibility of architecture as a mental construction as opposed to only a physical one?
Suppose we said
Are you?
that it's both.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but I wanted to know whether you're still invested in that.
In both?
In both. You've always had both.
Well, of course I'm still invested in both. I've always been, as you say, so what's the question?
Well, no, I ask you because in your teaching, I mean, I would be curious to know, in this heterogeneity versus non-heterogeneity, this would be the kind of, fact of what kind of thing one has made. A thing which has parts, a thing that does not. The question of me is what remains the part that's implicit? Where is the virtuality, what you called virtuality, which was, like the virtuality of virtual transparency versus literal. It's not the virtuality of computation. It's the idea of the implicit object, the imagined, the interpreted, the not there. When Colin said, "What's not there to you?" And that was the beginning of architecture for you.
Well, I just finished a book with my associate Matt Roman called Palladio Virtuale, which is a deconstruction of the ideal idea, the common row idea of Palladio, and how it deconstructs slowly over the time of Palladio from a centralized, volumetric, three-dimensional, real villa to a series of framing elements that have no central volume at all. Right. In other words, where the villa becomes virtual. It was there, it's no longer there. And you can trace this through, one of the reasons why it's never been done before is because the German art historians like Wittkover, Wöfflin, and others never considered the Palladian outbuilding as something important to the evolution of Palladio, which it clearly was. Ultimately, with the last villa at Santa Sofia, has no building at all. So that's what I mean by virtual, is the trace of the former condition of the villa proper, right? And that's why I call it Palladio Virtuelle, because in fact, it's a play on virtu, of virtuous, by the way. It's a play on the L shape, which, any number of things. But certainly the word virtual it really comes into playing if you look at Palladio. We're doing another book on Alberti, which is called Alberti Analogous. The analogous Alberti, which is also talking about not the real material, but the analog to the real material, which you can find in Alberti, and Mario is contributing an essay to that book. There's several, Dan Shearer is, etc. It's going to be a really very interesting book, but again, the virtual comes into play in a what is classically thought of as an historical context.
You see, for me, that's where you are fundamentally different than the projects you're talking about, Inge, or the projects that are being done in the studio here. I think that these are not invested in the dialectic. I don't see others invested, as you are, in a dialectic between an implied object, the object that is only thought through, the mental construct, and the actual one. I don't think Greg has any interest in that at all. He's interested in a real object that does real things, and that's it. There is no other object in Greg's work, and neither is there in most of the people today interested in ecologic or other things. There's no dialectic with a mental construct, and that fundamentally, it's not the heterogeneous versus not, it's not the presence of ground versus not, because by the way, Peter, a lot of your projects don't have a ground. I mean, all of the work before Canarosio, even the house, the houses could be upside down inside. The L is all about the state of objectivity, and you had to put it on the ground. That was arbitrary to it.
No question.
The crisis of the ground, then you internalized it, but that, still the dialectic continued between mental and real.
Yes, but I think, for example, from the embryological house or anything of the parametric prototyping right now, where you see the matrices, we work with the mental image as well. The only difference is that the way it's, let's say, inscribed is through a script. It's like so it's a little differently thought of. So essentially what you think of is the brackets within which the project may occur, and then you define very carefully, it's very authorized, by the way, this is only the polemic that's unauthored, but that you define very carefully what within this realm of possibility may then evolve as a project you exemplify. So there is an image, so because the image is even more so, it's the image of the entire set which you propose to your audience. So if Greg puts forward the embryological house, right, it's an entire polemic. It's this whole undoing of the part to whole, by the way, because it's thinking of it in terms of a seriality. It's like it calls them family because they are instantiations of one set of rules which have a certain realm of possibilities, which he just exemplifies a few of. So if we do, for example, Rocker-Lange does these parametric prototypes of high-rises, which take, in fact, existing plans and manipulate them towards more public space within them, but we flex them. We have a whole set of matrices, 5, in fact, with 25 iterations, and I could generate infinite many more, but the ones I have picked because I have this image, which is this virtual image, if you want to, of a whole family of possibilities which I would like to put forward. So it's just, so I would say it's not neglecting the idea of Alberti and others. It's just having, figured out a different type of battleground. And I would argue in reaction to Peter's project, because we're all children of his in a way, and we need to find our own battleground. So, and I think that's what we do. We have different techniques on our hands, but also, of course, we have different philosophical beliefs in the meanwhile acquired. So, and I think that's in that tension field we
just
work.
described, the versioning that you described, is still part of this idea of a dialectic with interpretation, processes of interpretation. It really is.
Right.
But I don't think the sales, the materials that, for example, are manifesting their performance, the performance, for example, with the boats of Greg's work now, has to do with that dialectic. That's the big split off.
Most of digital theory these days is about the production of technical objects,
Right.
which as such are perfectly irrelevant to the arguments we are discussing here.
Yeah.
It's a problem of engineering, not a problem of space making. Now, what is relevant to us is to what extent, if, when, and how does this tool interact with our discipline, which is about space making, etc., in a determinant way, which it did in the early 90s, because it did inflect the history of space making in a significant way, although not that which Peter had anticipated. And what I think is interesting now, if I can add a glimmer of hope, is that looking at these experiments, we can perceive that hijacking that the digital suffered in the 90s is coming to an end. Because this is not about spline making. This is not about simplifying the problem in order to solve it, which is what the mathematics of the 90s did. This is a new approach to the discipline of complexity, which can or could become again a friend to an architectural project, much as it was a foe in the 90s.
I'm not sure, I have to agree with Inge that whether or not the forms are smooth or fractured is not the issue, because either of them could be drawn into this dialectical project that Peter is interested in. I don't believe either one is necessarily at its root in disagreement with it in a dialectical approach to architecture of the kind that we're discussing now.
If you use the tools in a simplifying mode, which is what modern mathematics almost obliges.
But the matter of how you use the tools is not that relevant, it seems to me, to Peter's project.
But it does inflect the kind of space you're making.
I would love to get Stojanović back.
Yeah. Okay.
He's been very patient.
He has, but he's been buying time. I hope he's bought it.
Since there seems to be a defense through Mario and Ingeborg of your project, where is it going? In other words, where do you see it going in fact? In other words, because the fascination with that object, if we say, okay, let's start from there, how do we keep that object and make architecture as opposed to applied engineering, let's say?
Okay, the honest answer is I don't know. You have to come back next year and we can talk about architecture. Maybe, no, we're quick, but there is one thing that you've triggered, and it's the question of precedence. And you've mentioned Hernan and Greg as guys who are working in this area, and I don't think that necessarily this is that line of work. I'm more inclined to think that this sort of experiments are related to Frei Otto or Gaudi, as a matter of fact. You know, if you think of Gaudi's model for Colonia Coel, he was using elastic lines to create stone shape in the end, in a sense. So he's using the elasticity of the material in an analog way to define the most optimal structure, in a sense. And I know you have a lot to say against form finding in relation to decision making in design, in a sense. But I don't want to trigger another avalanche of questions.
Please do not, because we are wrapping up.
In the process that you're talking about, because you pick two of what I would call expressionist engineers, right? Phenomenologists. And to me, that makes me shiver. You know, I say, you're not coming back to where something we can be mediated. I don't believe, because if it's Frei Otto and Gaudi, we're in, for me, big trouble, right? We're going to get chicken coops. And that's what I say with these filament-based projects. I don't know how you get surface. You can't. It's hard to get surface out of Frei Otto and Gaudi because it's all liniment. And so I don't know why those would be the models.
It has to. I'm just one little sentence. The connection is the material behavior, and this is the line of study. That's the only connection, in a sense.
I have to ask before, because since I'm supposed to be active rather than sit here like slumped over, when Ingeborg says that she can make choice from what she calls the virtual, isn't it a choice of an image that you have in your mind, rather, a preordained image? Because I don't see choice accruing to the multiple possibilities that are produced in computation.
You don't see the choice. No, there is a choice, of course. I mean, even in your virtual house, Peter, was a choice we had. I mean, it was.
We're not talking about that's 20 years or 30 years ago.
It's not that old. I wasn't.
You're talking about
5 years old.
your work allows for making choices that are not aesthetic choices. You said.
There are strategical choices.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, look, my choices are, of course they are choices, and I'm having a discourse in mind. I have a certain, I guess, aesthetic eye, and I am very carefully calibrating my choices, of course. In the same way, by the way, you calibrated House 1 choices, of how you manipulated your House 1, and presented it in a certain array of things. In fact, I mean, the whole matrix business we do is literally a little quotation right there.
I've never said I don't make choices.
somebody's
No, but you caused us, essentially. We do matrices because of you. I hope you know that.
I would argue that every time a student presents something and they give me this hullabaloo about process and all this, I said, in the end, it either looks good or it don't, right? And I said, I'm sorry, this one don't look good. And ultimately...
Yeah, I say the same. It's better sexy, I say. It's rigorous and sexy, supposedly.
What?
Rigorous and sexy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Rigorous
what it. Yeah,
and sexy.
rigorous and sexy. Yeah, so
Rigorous
we
and
do the same thing, Peter. We're not that far away.
His work, Stojanović's work, is both rigorous and sexy, and it still doesn't qualify for me.
I think that's a perfect final word.
So I'm sorry, I'll have to interrupt this most interesting discussion by asking actually for questions from the floor. It will be a pity not to have feedback.
So
can we have some lights on, please?
Here.
We can hear it.
So I'm a student of architecture from Zagreb, Croatia. And in order to ask my question, I first have to set a context. First of all, as most of the students here, when Form Z was developed, we weren't born. And for example, I started studying architecture in 2008, and I came to this third stage of what Mr. Carpo said about digital and that stuff. And in this, let's say, confusing, it's not so easy to understand part of digital computing. And while I don't look this development, as you said it in these three ways, Mr. Eisenman on the beginning of the 90s, then Spline, then this, let's say, confusion, I found this beginning of computing while listening to my professor of theory in theory of architecture. She's Karin Sherman, GSD Harvard graduate. And while she was explaining Mr. Eisenman's houses, the first early works from houses 1 to 10, the explanation was exactly what Mrs. Rocker said about we have a line, we have a surface, and we have a volume, and we somehow iterate it or compute it, and we get a result. And for me, that was actually the theoretical beginning of this computing or digital technology. And then she said, I will be the Eisenman, you can ask me a question. And I asked her, okay, now if we had a Mr. Eisenman here, first question would be, would he use these algorithms then? Because it was presented to us as a way of removing the author from the process. And if so, why is the author removed? And so my first question was, as I said, and the other, why the author was removed, I somehow tried to explain it in maybe what was the next session about Adornian theory of autonomy of art or some domain. And I said, okay, maybe if we remove the author, we can dive in really into the autonomous architectural elements as Mr. Rocker also presented us. So that was the second part of the question, is that explanation true? And then the third one would be, if we look at this digital design as process of designing, not of producing the final designs, is then, again, we're leaving the domain, autonomous domain of Adornian architecture and putting it in some new tool that maybe it's a by domain, not the main domain of our work, if I'm clear.
I think you hit upon one of the weakest moments of my evolution, and that is the notion that they were authorless constructs, the early houses. What brought it to my mind how weak an idea this was, ultimately abandoned, was that for the Milan Triennale of 1973, again before you were born, I was asked to make a film of my house number 4. And there was an Austrian filmmaker at the time by the name of Peter Kubelka who made what were called flicker films. That is, they would interlace an image with a blank image, and then you would see the images flickering. And so I decided I would make a flicker film. I had one of my assistants draw 2,000 images of House 4 as they were developed, and we interlaced them with 2,000 black images and ran the thing. And honestly, what was interesting, you discovered there was an aesthetic connection that I would make between image 40 and image 41. But once it was interrupted with a black image, there was no connection between 40 and 41. It could have been 40 and 81 as far as that was concerned. And when I ran the film, all I saw was absolute chaos. That is, there was no process at all. It was purely an aesthetic judgment from A to B to C, etc. And I realized that, first of all, it was authored, and the authorization had nothing to do with a process of evolution. It was purely aesthetic decisions that I had fooled myself into thinking that I hadn't made, but which I had made. So for me, in 1973, with this terrible movie, which still exists somewhere, and you know, the craziness of making 2,000 images, I gave up the notion of authorless possibility. So to go back and revisit certain youthful mistakes, since we're talking 40 years ago, I think is rather problematic. I don't believe in that process, and if it unleashed, as Mario and Greg Lynn and others blame me for this kind of beginning, I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. And so I hope you'll forgive me for, no, I'm being very, I absolutely don't believe that it's possible. That's why I asked Ingeborg, because I asked Patrick Schumacher the same thing, is, Patrick, from those awful things that you make, how do you choose which one is better from awful, right? And he says, it doesn't matter, anyone will do. And I say, oh my God, then why do it if it doesn't matter? And so this problem of the production of the multiple, right, which is what we're talking about, I'm suggesting that you must build into the multiple inconsistency so there's a possible choice between X and Y. Because if the multiple produces homogeneous consistency, then you can't choose. And I think this is the problem of this project, the Patrick Schumacher project today. I mean, I love Zaha Hadid. With all of my might, she's one of my favorite architects. Yet, just yesterday, Cynthia and I were looking at the stadium she did for the Japanese Olympics, and I thought to myself, oh my God, why is it that I react strongly against this project? And could it be I'm so conservative today that I'm being like the classicists in 1929 that rejected Le Corbusier's League of Nations project because they thought, oh my God. And it could be that I just don't recognize quality, criticality, and all of the wonderful things that Zaha, who's a great artist and whose work I used to admire enormously, see in the project that she's doing. So it could be that I am so old-fashioned and so problematized by today, by you, and by Stojanović, that I don't know how to make a critical judgment of what I see. And I think the problem for architecture today is how do you form a critical judgment of the things that Patrick and Zaha and Greg Lynn and others and Ingeborg Rocker are doing, when in fact much of what they're doing come out of a spirit of having worked with you, me, and reacting against me, which is a smart thing to do, right? Both Ingeborg and Greg worked in the office for a period of time. She did Berlin. She did the Holocaust Memorial with much storm and drama, but nevertheless. And Greg worked for 5 years in the office. So you would expect that kind of reaction. I'm hoping that to avoid your reaction, because you're a third generation down, I would like you to react against her and Greg rather than me, because I want to get off the stage.
Okay, so with these very interesting questions lingering in the air, I suggest we stop this session because we are out of time and go for a very short coffee break, come back at 5:15 and continue this discussion.
Sorry, can I just...
Wait a minute. Wait.
Sorry, just a brief comment. It's not even a question. Okay. My name is Anatoly. I'm from University of Belgrade. I don't need a microphone. Yes. Okay. Can everybody hear me? This is so weird.
Yes,
anyway, so at the moment when you ask Djordje Stojanović, what is the purpose of his studies? How come that he's teaching us architecture? I think that it's very important his role in a process of our education, because imagine if there wasn't projects or courses like this one. Our studies would be much more homogeneous, and as we all know, that's a bad thing. So I think that projects like this are very important and should be part of our studies. So that's all. Thank you.
Did we think that they weren't? We did discuss them. They provoked a discussion, so I would assume the provocation and I think that they are necessary. We're not suggesting that they're not. The question that I suggested was, once you produce this, now guys, now that you know you can do this, what's next? That's the issue. And the thing is to leave the result suspended like that and fetishize the suspension, by the way, which is worrisome for me, because you can get entranced with the object and suggest that that's where it ends. And that what was worrying me as a pedagogical method is, what is the next step? What I would like Stojanović at some point to articulate in the next 2 days, where this research can go from there. Because I find there a wonderful end rather than a wonderful beginning. And he has to convince me that in fact it's a beginning.
Thank you very much. I think we're
Okay.